Ladies and gentlemen, and very welcome to this session. People outside may not be aware of the fact that it's so nice and cool in here, but maybe that they'll find their way in due course. I must say we're very glad as a group that's organized this symposium that we've been assigned such a huge auditorium, because it acknowledges the importance of dual diagnosis, the problem of drugs use and substance abuse in youngsters, whereas one of the take-home messages will be that the field of addiction services does not welcome youngsters with psychopathology, nor do adolescent units show any eagerness to accept youngsters that are taking drugs. So the format of today is slightly different because one of the presenters, Christian Kouwenberg, is moving this week and is changing jobs. So she wasn't in the opportunity to come here, and Patricia van Wijngaarden has combined in her lecture both presentations. So I'll give an introduction on the subject, and then afterwards Patricia van Wijngaarden will have quite a longer talk than maybe anticipated. Then Geert van der Glint will give ADHD as a form of psychopathology as an example of dual diagnosis and how to deal with it in services. And my co-chair will then give some comments, and that will be the introduction to the general discussion. So the first thing is that substance use disorders in youth are not only a problem for society in Europe, but also for the services. What I'll do is I'll talk about some of the data we have from ESPAT, which show us the extent of the problem. And one of the take-home messages will be that the use of illicit drugs is quite small through Europe and diminishing, but the use and the abuse of legal drugs as tobacco and alcohol is on the rise in most of our countries, and there are some worrying trends. So I'll be talking about the availability, the secondary problems as reported in ESPAT, and then I'll end up with drawing some conclusions on the consequences that this should have for our services, especially in mental health, and training for our residents in psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry. So one of the nice things is that from the early 90s of the last century, the European School Survey project on alcohol and other drugs has given us a very clear overview of the extent to which legal and illicit drugs are a problem in our country, in our continent. The ESPAT has surveys about every 3 or 4 years, and the most recent one in younger adolescents was from 2003, and a recent one was published this year in youngsters aged 17 and 18. And what I'll do, I'll combine some of the data from that evidence. If you want to go more into detail and see how your country in terms of substance use and abuse relates to other countries in our continent, you can go to the ESPAT website, where all the reports are available both on the web and in PDF files. So one of the striking facts is that when you read magazines or you look into journals, governments and politicians are very much aware of the fact that illicit drugs, cannabis, marijuana, hashish, but also ecstasy, mushrooms, heroin, cocaine, form a big problem. There's a problem of drug-related delinquency. That's a big concern to most of our politicians. But the fact of the matter is that the legal drugs are a much bigger problem and have something paradoxal in that sense that most countries make a huge amount of money by inning the taxes on tobacco and alcohol. Most journalists seem only now to discover that along with the problem of drugs-related crime and illicit drug use and abuse, there is really a trend in society with a tremendous increase in the use and abuse of legal drugs. So if we look at the most recent ESPOT data, I'll give you every time the top of the European community and the European countries, and then the bottom. So if we go into tobacco, it appears that 82% of the people in Lithuania have, at age 15 to 18, have ever smoked, which holds true for about 3/4 of the youngsters in Greece, and all the other countries are in between. Regular smokers are found also mostly in Lithuania. For nearly half of the youngsters between 15 and 18 are regular smokers, and the lowest country in the survey, Sweden, it holds true for 1/3. So when you realize how much effort is being put into reducing tobacco, and if you go to the United States, you know, you're really an outcast if you only consider smoking, whereas our youth are smoking rather in the same fashion as about 20 to 30 years ago. And a remarkable fact, which you will all be aware of, is that the differences between girls and boys are only very small. In some countries, the difference in ever smoking or regular smoking is less than 5%. So that means that girls are really catching up in that respect. All over Europe, at the age of 15 to 18, 19% of the youngsters report having taken alcohol ever. Boys differ from girls. The interesting thing is that in Western and Northwestern Europe, girls drink much more than in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe. And one of the striking features is that the countries well known for their wine industry, like Italy, France, Greece, have in fact the lowest consumption, and it's more the beer drinking, the binge drinking in the UK and the northern European countries that is much higher. So you see that the lowest countries on regular alcohol consumption at the age 15 to 18 are Italy and Greece. But binge drinking and overt drunkenness is something that's really taking over in most of our countries, and you see that Poland and Sweden are top of the bill, and the lowest country is France with only 2/3 about. But there's a very worrying trend when it comes to alcohol because binge drinking is really taking enormous proportions in northwestern Europe, but also in Spain. And I'll explain further on in my talk that it's even more worrying because the drinking does not take place at home nor in public pubs or restaurants, but it's, so to say, self-contenting, and there is no real supervision to these youngsters drinking. And in northwestern Europe, girls are really catching up in a very worrying way, and it's not something to be proud of, but in our country, the Netherlands, 1 in 5 girls age 14 are reported to have been drunk at least once in the past month, which is incredible when we know how harmful alcohol at that stage of the development of the brain can be. So the legal drugs are really in tremendous fashion in most of our countries, and they're on the rise. There are much more smokers, there are much more drinkers, and as I said, binge drinking is really worrying. When it comes to cannabis, one of the striking features is that France and other countries where there's a very restricted policy with regard to cannabis, hashish and marijuana are the ones where the consumption is the highest. So one of the points we'll be making is that the policies that the governments put in place to restrict or to try to dam in the use of cannabis doesn't work, and on the contrary, in those countries the youngsters say that cannabis is very easily or fairly easily available. When you see that 40% of the French youngsters between 15 and 18 smoke cannabis on a regular basis, so several times a week, and Sweden, on the contrary, is very low, so there are huge differences over Europe. When it comes to the real worrying drugs like stimulants or ecstasy, the prevalence rates drop dramatically. When it comes to stimulants and ecstasy, the lifetime prevalence of experimenting with these substances is in average 4% in Europe, with very little differences between them. This holds true in an even more skewed fashion for LSD, cocaine, paddos, mushrooms and heroin, which over Europe is being used on lifetime basis in far less than 1%. But the interesting thing about the SPAT is that we have some remarkable exceptions. It's incredible to think that Italy reports that, or the Italian youngsters report that 7% have once or on regular basis tried cocaine, and that 3% have smoked or injected heroin, which is much higher than wherever in Europe. One of the interesting things of the ESPAT is that there are questionnaires which range from 300 questions to 174, so different countries apply the questionnaire in a very strict fashion or apply it to the local circumstances, but they give not only information on the use and the abuse of drugs, but also on eventually secondary problems. And the interesting thing is that in the whole survey of ESPAT, the secondary problems are more social problems and not emotional or behavioral problems. So from that source we have little information about the possibility that people could be suffering from a dual diagnosis with both psychopathology and drugs use and abuse. But the problems that are very prevalent all over Europe is that taking illegal or illicit or legal drugs on a regular basis has an impact on your life. It has an impact on school performances, drop out of school. It has a tremendous impact on relationships. Youngsters get isolated or get shifting into small groups of junkies or delinquent people. Many girls and boys report that they, under influence of substances, have engaged willingly or mostly unwillingly in sexual activities which they regret afterwards, and about 80% of the people that of the youngsters that report positively on taking whichever drug regularly mention that they have trouble with the police. When asked about the availability of substances throughout Europe, most of the youngsters 17 years of age, regardless the policy of the country, whether it's been sold in special coffee shops like in our country or it's completely illegal on the black market, like in France. Youngsters aged 70 report that it's very easy to get access to those drugs, or fairly easy under other circumstances. So policies of permissivity or repressivity do not influence the feeling the youngsters have. What I was telling was that binge drinking is a problem that is taking over, and when you read in magazines or in the newspapers, there's been reports in Spain where there are special parties where people go with a huge amount of bottles of alcohol and settle down in a public park or somewhere near a river and have huge drinking parties without any supervision whatsoever. And I was telling about these youngsters in the Netherlands, young girls aged 13, 14, who go into caravans or other kind of containers where they just get together and start drinking. And the funny thing is that a couple of months ago there was a meeting with the police and some people from the official pubs, and the pubs were complaining heavily that the youngsters in the region of Zwolle were too drunk to really drink and pay for it once they came to town. But even worrying is that the age is decreasing. And one of the reasons the age is decreasing is that alcohol in the form of beer and wine does not fit one's taste till one is about 16, 17 or 18, which in a natural fashion is protecting, as we know that by that time the development of the brain has reached nearly adult proportions. But when wine and beer is turned into alcohol pops, when you can get breezes that taste like lemonade but give you access to huge quantities of alcohol, then as a 13, 14 or even in our country 10, 11-year-old, you're not put off by that anymore. On the other hand, it's striking to see that even in permissive countries, rules that are said that should be applied are not applied at all. Girls in our country can go to a supermarket age 12 or 13 and carry through the cashier with wine, alcohol, beverages in all sorts without anyone stopping them. Boys are caught more often. What is worrying too in ESPAT, that is that there's a huge contrast between, on one hand, what is said in the public campaigns throughout Europe, where everyone is warned strongly not to abuse alcohol, tobacco or other drugs, especially not when participating in the traffic, but they seem to have nearly a paradoxical effect on youngsters who, through the different ESPAT surveys, report an absolutely positive, unrealistic vision as to what the dangers could be of abusing substances. And worrying is that in the most European countries, parental control does not seem to extend much further than the own home, and parents are very lenient when it comes to open drunkenness of their children outside. And you could say that in the first ESPAT surveys, it were the students, age 18 plus, who were living outside of the home, who were the binge drinkers, and now it are just the youngsters from 14 on that in the weekends binge drink for one or two occasions. When we look at the addiction units for adolescents, it's striking that all through Europe these are very sparse. Though we read in the newspapers every day that there's a tremendous lot of drug use and abuse around, though we realize through these ESPAT surveys that it's a huge problem, there is very, very little services. And when there are services for addiction, these units tend to be very strict in rejecting youngsters that have any form of psychopathology, because they feel uncomfortable with psychosis, depression, conduct disorder, emotional problems, and they say, well, we acknowledge that you are using and abusing drugs, and we should like to invite you on our program, but there's no way we're going to accept you because you have psychological problems that we cannot deal with. On the other hand, most of the adolescent wards throughout Europe, in their admittance policy, clearly state that any drug misuse or abuse is a reason for ejection. So that means that these youngsters who have both substance use and misuse and psychopathology are really at risk of being rejected from both sides. A very interesting feature, though, is that adolescent wards seem to ignore the fact that their patients are using and abusing drugs, and that is because they don't ask. And in a recent study we did with Wim van der Brink from the Amsterdam University, Chrisje Kouwenberg had a countrywide screening of adolescent units with the CAGE questionnaire, 5 or 6 questions to ask about drug use, and it appeared that the adolescent units that denied having any regular drug users in their wards, in fact, had 20% of their population which fulfilled the criteria for substance abuse disorder. When you look at the curricula of resident training throughout Europe, both in adult psychiatry and in child and adolescent psychiatry, the knowledge and the experience on substances, substance abuse, and how to deal with them is very, very small, and the number of hours spent is ridiculous when you compare it to the extent of the problems. But on the other hand, the same holds true for addiction units, where even in our country we are only now starting to train people to be more aware of what psychopathology is and how it interacts with drug use and abuse. So, when we draw some conclusions, the first one is that in our countries most people worry about a problem that's not that big and seem to want to ignore a problem which just round the corner, illicit binge drinking and smoking, which is really a big problem. And it's a problem that's really on the rise in very young adolescents from their early teens on. Mental health services in most countries are only over the past years starting to become aware of the fact that dual diagnoses are very common. And it's very important to include this in the training of child and adolescent psychiatrists. And that's why I'm very glad that I can now announce the next presenter, Patricia van Wijngaarden-Kremers, who will not only tell something about the definitions, but also give some results from studies that we've been doing to show the extent to which dual diagnoses are a real problem. That's the topic, and that's where I want to end by acknowledging our team, which has been active for the past 4 years and is extending. Patricia van Wijngaarden and myself are present today. Chrisje Kouwenberg could have come. Bram Cizo is doing important work on the use and the abuse of substances in people with autism and ADHD, and Wim van der Brink is a worldwide celebrity when it comes to addiction. Thank you for your attention.